Alright, hello my apocalyptic students. Welcome to yet another video on the book of Revelation. Basically, I'm going to see in this one video if I can take you through chapters 12 all the way to the end. Simply because with Thanksgiving break coming up, I don't know if I'll be able to make another video during the break. So I'm going to try to finish my talking about Revelation in this video, but then you'll have the assignment due, I think, next Monday on 12 to 16, and then there'll be a final one on 12 to on 17 to the end, and then after that we'll just have the final to do. So one of the things I'm going to try to send you is kind of an overview chart of the whole book of Revelation as a whole. I don't know if I'll get it into this next assignment, but definitely the last one. And it kind of gives an overview chart of how the whole thing plays out. Basically, Revelation comes in two parts. After the little prologue at the beginning of chapters 1 through 3, starting with the throne room in chapter 4, there's a progression of events where there's a scene in heaven, and then it comes down to earth, and things play out. Ends the first half of Revelation with that end of chapter 11 with the kingdom of the world. The world has become the kingdom of Christ. You know, if you read the very end of chapter 11, it seems like it's a end of the story. But then starting in chapter 12 to the end, the things play out again. The scene starts, as we're going to see shortly, with a vision of in heaven, the woman clothed with the sun and the dragon, and then the scene shifts to earth, and things play out, and then it ends with a vision of the new creation in the New Jerusalem. And the way I kind of put it, and you'll see this eventually when you get to the chart, chapters 4 through 11 kind of emphasize the immediate threat, in this case of Rome persecuting the Christians in history, and it plays out, and it's reassurance that God's going to deal with Rome. But then when you get to chapter 12 to the end, the curtain is pulled back and you see the real battle behind the historical Rome. It's the dragon fighting the woman and her offspring, the church, and the power behind Rome, the ultimate evil that God deals with in the second half of Revelation. But I'll explain that a little more as we go through it. As always, if you can, please do read the blog posts that I've written. I think that just lays out so much more than I can get through in a video. I figured since I wrote them a couple years ago, I might as well make use of them. That being said, this specific assignment your next assignment is chapters 12 through 16. So let me just jump right in and talk you through the whole thing because it is so good. And again, there's more to it that you can read in the blog posts, to learn more about it. But here right now, we're going to hit the highlights. Okay, let me open up here. Chapter 12. There we go. Chapter 12. The scene starts in heaven. And the vision you get is of a woman clothed with the sun. She's about to give birth, and a great dragon. Basically, what you really need to see is that the woman clothed with the sun represents Israel. And it goes back to an allusion, back to the Genesis story of Eve, in chapter 3 of Genesis, when Eve takes bite of the fruit, and God shows up and he curses the serpent. And in Genesis 3:16, he basically says, I'm going to put an enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. That really sets the stage of the entire Old Testament story, and that is what is being referred to here in chapter 12 and 13. Basically, in the Old Testament, you have to know this background, it's written in the blog post. In the Old Testament, the Israelites viewed themselves as being the offspring of the woman. God's going to work through them to redeem creation. That's the offspring of the woman. The offspring of the serpent that is going to fight against the offspring of the woman in Genesis 3:16 is seen along in the lines of all the bad countries in the Old Testament. If you look at the genealogies in those early chapters of Genesis, it kind of lays out. You have the woman, the offspring. Then you have Cain and Abel. Cain does what he does. He proves himself to be the serpent's offspring. Seth takes the place of Abel. He's going to be the woman's offspring. It plays out into Noah's sons. Ham, the father of Canaan, he's bad. He's the serpent's offspring. Shem and Jephthah, they're the woman's offspring. And if you look in the genealogies, the Hebrews come from the line of Shem. All the bad countries in the Old Testament come from the line of Ham and Cain. Okay? But the fundamental thing is, from the biblical perspective, is God promises to redeem all of his creation, and he's going to work through humanity, the woman's offspring, to deal with sin and death and curse. But he's also going to have to fight against the serpent's offspring, so to speak. And that's within humanity itself. All that in the background, what you see here in Revelation 12 is you have that Genesis stuff played out in the heavenlies. The serpent, the dragon, the woman clothed with the sun is Israel, who is also has ties to Eve. And he tries to destroy the child whom she's giving birth to. And by the way it's described, he's going to rule the nations with a rod of iron. He ascends to heaven. The child is clearly Jesus. Jesus comes from Israel. After he ascends to heaven, we're told that the dragon pursues the woman. There's a lot of Exodus echoes in here. She has a place out in the wilderness where she's going to be cared for. And when he can't get her, at the very end of chapter 12, we are told that he turns to make war with the rest of her offspring. If you're a good biblical student, right there you should go, oh, this goes back to Genesis 3:16. This is the ultimate offspring battle between evil and the offspring of evil within humanity and the offspring of the woman, which is going to be now the church. If Christ is the ultimate offspring, his brothers and sisters, those who put their faith in him, that's the church. And so what is being described here in chapter 12 and 13 is the Christians who are being persecuted. They see themselves as, we're part of the offspring of the woman. We're brothers and sisters of Christ. That's why we're being persecuted. And it's not just through Rome. It's the evil behind Rome, which is the serpent, the dragon himself. All right? And so that is what you see in chapter 12. There's a lot there that you should see. Now, what you then do is when you turn to chapter 13, this is the two beasts that he calls up out of the sea. The very fact that the dragon calls up this beast out of the sea tells you that this beast gets its power from the dragon, because the sea of chaos is representative of evil and all that stuff. And the way that the beast is described in the original first century context would be understood to be the emperor of Rome, Domitian in this case. But at the same time, like Bosek mentions in his book, it's not just Domitian. This figure of the sea beast represents any ruler who sets himself up as a god and who persecutes God's people. So in that sense, you could say Stalin was an incarnation of the beast. Hitler was an incarnation of the beast. That's how we see it. But in the historical context of the first century, it's clearly Domitian. And the way he is described, this is also another allusion to the book of Daniel, chapter 7, where Daniel sees a vision of 4 beasts coming up out of the sea, and they're evil empires in this Old Testament context. But here, this one sea beast is a conglomeration of all of them. And what we see is he gets his authority from the dragon. He has all the leopard, bear, lion conglomeration, that's a good word, of Daniel's vision. And we're told that he gets the authority. He has a mouth to blaspheme for 42 months. Again, all of that is an allusion to Daniel 7. If you read Daniel 7 and read my blog posts a little bit, it'll explain a little more. But the point is, the sea beast is Domitian. He is the embodiment of evil because he's persecuting God's faithful. Okay? The fact that he has blasphemous names on his head, Domitian was the first emperor to force people to call himself Lord and Savior and God. That's interesting. the fact that he has a fatal wound that was healed, it's kind of a reference to Nero, because Nero was the first one to persecute Christians, but that persecution only took place in Rome. When he committed suicide, they thought that was over and done with. But with Domitian, Domitian was kind of seen symbolically, if you will, as Nero 2.0. He has a wound. We thought we got rid of Antichrist Nero, but now he's back in the form of Domitian, so to speak. That's what that's about. And the very fact that people are worshiping him, that's a reference to the imperial cult that Domitian really took charge of. He wanted people to worship him as God. And that leads us to the land beast, the beast out of the earth. When you read the description of what this land beast does, basically this land beast is gets the world to worship the sea beast. That is a reference to the imperial cult that was going on in the first century, which was basically the Roman Empire's political attempt to force people to worship the emperor as a god. And so that is what you see with the beast out of the land. It gets everybody to focus on the sea beast. Now, one interesting thing, it says that it makes an image of the sea beast, of the first beast, and causes the beast as if to talk. In the ancient world, when they had idols, what they would do, oftentimes if you go into a temple, you'd have the major image of that god, in this case it would be Caesar, and they would hollow out the head, and the priest would get into the head and would speak from the image. So if you go into the temple, it's as if the image is talking to you. That's what that's getting at. Another thing that I should mention, I don't think I mentioned it in my blog post, but the very fact that the first beast comes out of the sea and this beast comes out of the land, this also is an allusion to the ancient mythological creatures of chaos, Leviathan and Behemoth. These are those who vault themselves against God and who pray against God's people. And so that's another thing worth noting. But that's chapter 13, okay? The 666 thing, Bosek mentions it. I mentioned something in my blog post. Basically, it's not a barcode that, 666 is not, let's see, do we have a, it's not this thing. You are a slave to either Caesar or Christ, and because you're a slave, you're going to be marked either way. And 666, it's like a triple attempt at 7 of God and a triple failing. It's the number of man. It's also, in Hebrew, the numerical value of the name Nero Caesar is 666. So there's that. That's kind of an interesting thing. Now, when we move on to chapter 14, interestingly enough, now you got to see it in the whole narrative. The dragon is fighting the woman. The child escapes. The ultimate offspring, Christ, escapes. The woman escapes. So the dragon turns and fights the rest of the woman's offspring with his offspring, if you will, the sea beast and the land beast. Get it? Now, with a picture of the sea beast and the land beast, we turn to chapter 14. We have a vision of the Lamb, the ultimate offspring, Christ, along with the rest of the offspring, the 144,000 that we saw way back earlier in Revelation. Okay? And so what you see here is that it lays out who the offspring are. Christ and the beast, well, Christ and his offspring, the 144,000, those who are martyred, and the beast and the sea beast and the land beast. Now, the way they're described, they have the name of the Lamb on their foreheads. This is like the servants of the beast have their 666. The 144,000, those of Christ, have him on them. They're with the Lamb on Mount Zion. They're redeemed from the earth. They've gone through the tribulation. They're suffering, and now they're reigning with Christ. I mentioned a couple things on my blog about how they haven't defied themselves with women. That's an allusion to in the ancient, in the Old Testament, during times of holy war, fighters had to keep themselves sexually pure. So it doesn't, these 144,000, it's not a literal 144,000, and they're not literally virgins. It's a way of saying they are purified for the holy battle, so to speak. That's what that means. Now, they're called the first fruits. Again, that is important to realize using the agricultural image. the martyrs, the 144,000, who sacrificed themselves for the gospel, they are the first fruits along with Christ of the kingdom of God. And then the rest of the world, you and me, so to speak, who come into Christ, so to speak, we're the full harvest. They're the first fruits. We're the rest of humanity is the full harvest. All right? So that's kind of an interesting thing. And what you see at the end of chapter 14, you see this very thing. There's two harvests that happen. The Son of Man harvests, and it's kind of like a grain harvest, okay? That is, if you will, the salvation of the rest of the world. If the martyrs are the first fruits, the grain harvest is the harvest of the world, so to speak. But then after that, going along with grape and wine imagery, the second harvest is the grape harvest. And this is going to be significant from here on out in Revelation. The grape harvest is the blood of the saints, so to speak. And because the whore of Babylon, which is mentioned, the Babylon the Great, comes later, what you're going to see is because Babylon the Great is guilty of drinking the blood of the martyrs, so to speak, because she drinks their blood, God is going to force her then to drink a second cup, the cup of his wrath, which comes about precisely because the blood of the martyrs was shed. And so the second harvest is the grape harvest, and this is going to be brings in the winepress of God's wrath, and that's going to lead us into what we get later on in Revelation. But again, there's more to it that you can read on the blog post and in the Bosek article, Bosek book. Now, chapter 15, we get it's a very short picture, and this is the beginning of the 7 plagues. And basically, the sign that the vision that John sees in chapter 15 is he sees a sea of glass mixed with fire, and he sees those who have conquered the beast. This would be the 144,000. And they're by the sea singing the song of Moses. Now, that's significant because it's Exodus imagery. He's equating the salvation of the believers going through the sea of troubles, the sea of tribulation, if you will, coming out the other side. Even though they've been slain by the beast, they've come out through the sea of tribulation, so to speak, and they are singing the song of Moses. It's the song of salvation. And so everything in chapter 15 what exemplifies what I call the ultimate exodus. The ultimate salvation of God's people is spoken about with the language of the Exodus. Okay? That's all that chapter 15 is about. And again, you can read more about it on my blog post. Now, this is what prepares the 7 bowls of wrath. And in chapter 16, they just come one after the other. And you can do the assignment, you'll see it just boom, 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 boom. It's the very fact that they're called the 7 bowls of God's wrath. This is the wrath that God brings upon the world along with the salvation that he gets of God's people. It's the day of the Lord, day of Yahweh, day of Christ language. When he saves his people, he's going to bring wrath upon his enemies. And that's what you get in chapter 16. And you see it's the wrath comes upon all of creation. The 5th bowl, it's the throne of the beast. The 6th bowl, it's the great river Euphrates, which when you go back to the 5th and 6th seal and the 5th and 6th trumpet, there's a correlation pattern of events, how they go about. And so basically but the point is God's wrath is going to come upon all the created order, both Rome and both even the Parthians if need be. All will be affected with God's wrath. Okay? Now that much is for your next assignment, but I want to keep going because I want you to get all this. From this point on, let me see here. I'm trying to get to it. From chapter 17 to the end, the scene shifts to the great whore of Babylon. Okay? And when you read chapter 17, now this part, from this point on, if you want to pause it and watch this later for the next assignment, you can, or you can just keep plowing through. You're welcome to do whatever you want. I'm just making the video. Okay, I'm talking to you, and I'm looking up my notes as well. So, all right, when we get to chapter 17, he sees this picture of the great whore who sits on many waters. She has made the citizens of the earth drunk from the wine of her whoring. Some translations say prostituting, sexual immorality. The Greek word, that's what it means. It's kind of a shocking way to say it. Basically, what it gets right down to is this. If the beast is the Roman emperor, the whore of Babylon is Rome. Okay? And we're told that the whore of Babylon sits upon the beast. You know, it's the emperor who makes Rome go, basically. So, what you see basically, the fundamental picture that you see of the whore of Babylon as Rome is that she is guilty of drinking the blood of the saints. And because she is guilty of drinking the blood of the saints, she's going to then drink God's wrath. That is the heart and soul of what you get in chapter 17. And you could read more about the specifics. When you do the homework, it should make more sense. When you read the blog post, it'll make more sense. Some of the stuff that is being described about the great whore and the beast is a little confusing, but basically what you see is the whore of Babylon is going to be destroyed when the beast and the kings of the earth conspire to rip her apart and kill her. And again, this kind of goes back to what we saw in the trumpets and the seven seals, is one of the ways God is going to bring about wrath upon Rome is going to come from the emperor himself, who's going to destroy it, as well as foreign kings who are going to destroy it. The proud and haughty are going to be destroyed both from in the inside and the out. That's kind of what it is getting at. Once she is destroyed, in chapter 18, you have the fall of Babylon. It's a huge lament. And what you want to notice here is the groups of people who are lamenting. It's the kings of the earth, which is ironic because they kill her. The kings of the earth lament over her death. The sailors lament over her death, and the merchants lament over her death. When you read it all, it gets to a very basic point. Why would the kings of the earth, who were in bed with the whore of Babylon, so to speak, who got rich off of the whore of Babylon, why would the kings of the earth, the merchants, and the sailors all lament that she's dead? It's because that's how they got rich. They became rich off the materialism and the adultery, if you will, of the Roman Empire. And so when that goes down, their income is going to go bye-bye as well. And one of the interesting things to note, specifically when it talks about the merchants of the land weeping and mourning over her in verses 11 to 13. It's just a list of all the stuff they traded. It ends with slavery, which is treating human beings as less than human beings. The slave trade is what brings them down. And that is why the whore of Babylon is destroyed. It's not only fighting against God's people, but it is dehumanizing people who are made in God's image as well. That's chapter 18. Now, chapter 19 is the opposite. If you have the whore of Babylon here, chapter 19 is going to be all about the marriage supper of the Lamb. Everything in Revelation is kind of polar opposites. Rome versus the heavenly Jerusalem. Here, the whore of Babylon versus the bride of Christ. And it goes like that. So when she dies, the kings of the earth, the merchants of the earth, the sailors of the earth are mourning. But when you get in the beginning of chapter 19, there is the crowd in heaven praising God because he's finally dealt with it forever. And when that happens, you have the marriage supper of the Lamb in chapter 19, 5 to 10. All right? So you have the marriage supper of the Lamb and the bride of Christ contrasted with the whore of Babylon. Okay? Now, at the end, getting near the end of chapter 19, you have two things. You have a rider on the white horse in verse 11 to 16. When you read it, it's clear that the rider on the white horse, that's hard to say, is Jesus. And once again, the way he's described there, it takes you back all the way to Revelation 1, the way he's described there, and it contrasts the rider on the white horse of the first seal, which is Rome. It's another contrast. After Rome, the rider on the white horse of Rome brings death and destruction and wrath and corruption. God's going to deal with that through the rider on the white horse, Christ, who is the opposite of Rome. Okay? Then, at the end of chapter 19, you have the Great Supper of God. And this is another thing that we've seen a lot in a lot of the apocalyptic stuff that we've looked at. And again, this contrasts with the marriage supper of the Lamb. The marriage supper of the Lamb is for those who've suffered with Christ, the bride of Christ, married to Christ now in the great wedding supper. Contrast that with the great supper of God. Those who are destroyed, the kings of the earth, the evil ones, they're destroyed, and they become the supper of the birds of the air. Okay? And we've if you think back to a lot of the passages we've looked at in the other parts of this semester, you've seen that. So basically, this contrast is either you take part in the marriage supper of the Lamb, or you become the supper in the great supper of God. That's what the contrast is. Chapter 20 deals with some stuff that if you ever have gotten into conversations about the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and millennialism, post, mid-millennialism, post-trib, all that stuff, chapter 20 is for you. And there's a lot there, which, again, I encourage you to read the blog post which talks about this. Basically, what it ultimately, the end result is, Satan is still around. He's not, the whore of Babylon is destroyed, but the ultimate end hasn't yet come. And again, this is very apocalyptic mindset. The final end hasn't come yet. And so therefore, we're told that Satan is bound for 1,000 years, and the martyred saints will reign with Christ for 1,000 years. What that actually means, there is a number of different theories. I talk about it a little bit in my blog post. You have historical premillennialism, the dispensationalist view of premillennialism. That's like the Left Behind series. I'll tell you right now, I don't agree with that. Then there's postmillennialism and amillennialism. You can read about that and wrestle with that for yourself. Okay. Anyway, when you finally, after that, when you get to verses 7 through 10, you know, with Satan is released again, and so basically it's almost kind of like Genesis 1 through 3 again. There's just like the serpent was allowed to tempt Adam and Eve in God's original creation. In God's new creation, Satan is released for one more try. This time, though, he's going to be defeated. Okay? And when he's defeated, ultimately, you have the great white throne judgment at the end of chapter 20. And this is really about the ultimate defeat of Satan and the beast. And this brings you all the way back to full circle, summarizing the promise that God made in Genesis 3:16 that he's going to finally crush the head of the serpent. Finally, this is where it comes into full fruition. The dragon is thrown into the lake of fire. If you look at my blog post on this one, I also give you 2 other blog posts that I wrote on the issue of the biblical view of Hades and hell, or Gehenna. You know, is there going to be eternal torment, or what does that mean? That's not really related to this course, but you can read that if you will. Once the judgment comes, the big thing you get in the end, chapters 21 and 22, is the ultimate ending. It's the new creation. It's the new Jerusalem. And what you get is a number of interesting things. There's a new heavens and earth. The first one is gone bye-bye. And he looks and he sees the heavenly city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from heaven. And there is much rejoicing. But with the interesting thing in chapter 21, verses 9 through 27, when he sees the bride, the New Jerusalem is the bride, okay? And he goes up a high mountain and he sees a vision of the New Jerusalem. And the description, when it gets right down to it, he's describing the New Jerusalem as a giant cube when you look at the dimensions. He's not saying that it's the Borg for all you Star Trek fans. Here's the significance of the cube description of the New Jerusalem. In the temple, the Old Testament temple, the Holy of Holies was basically a cube room. It was perfect dimensions, okay? And so what John is saying, it's kind of like what Ezekiel said when he described the New Jerusalem as the eschatological temple as filling up the whole city of Jerusalem. Everything will be holy. Here, John is saying the New Jerusalem, everything will be holy. The Holy of Holies will be the New Jerusalem, the new creation. Okay? The fact that it's described with 12, everything that echoes the 12 tribes, the 12 apostles. You could read that. There's 12 gates. And he notices that there's no temple in this new city. Why? Because the whole city is the Holy of Holies. That's why God's presence has filled everything. That's what you get in chapter 21. And in chapter 22, he sees echoes of Eden galore. This is full circle of how the whole Bible starts. He sees the river of life. He sees on each side of the river of life the tree of life, bearing fruit for all seasons. He sees the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it. His servants will serve him. They will see his face. Everything is wrapped up. What began with the old creation and the curse is now the new creation, and there is no more curse. The fall has now been remedied. The serpent has now been crushed, and everyone is now in the new creation, and it's the end. It's the perfect conclusion to the entire biblical story. And it's kind of a really, really cool thing. Okay. You could read more in the blog post, the Bosek book as well. That assignment for chapters 17 to 22 will be next week. I'll have that up, but I wanted to make the video now so you can do that. All right. Well, by the time you watch this whole thing and do the homework assignments, once the 12 to 16 assignments done and then the 17 to 22 assignments done, that is basically the assignments. All that will be left will be the final, and I will get you an email that specify what to expect in the final in a couple weeks. Okay, I hope that works. I hope you enjoy this. I hope you have enjoyed everything for that matter. And there we go. All right, thanks.